Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on Everything Counts, Building a Control Regime for Non-Strategic Nuclear Weapons in Europe. The ambition of the United States to gain some control over the disposition of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe goes back a long way. The ratification of the New START Treaty was conditioned, informally at least, on an understanding that the United States would redouble its efforts to accomplish an arms control regime in this area as a part of the next arms control cycle. And of course, events have conspired to make this a less tractable problem than it already was. But this doesn't discount the urgency of working on the task and trying to identify reasonable solutions to the problems that would be presented by the negotiation of a control regime in this area. Some excellent new work on this topic has been done by the project that we're going to hear about today. And it's my pleasure to welcome the project team. The project senior advisor is Rose Gottemoeller, well known to this community. Rose, thanks so much for joining us again. For those who somehow don't know Rose, she's first of all and most importantly a senior fellow at CGSR. But beyond that, she's the Stephen Házy Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. And before joining Stanford, she was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, where she helped to drive forward NATO's adaptation to the new security challenges in Europe. She's joined by William Moon, a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, and Miles Pomper, project lead for this project at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. William was, until recently, the Global Nuclear Security Program Manager for Cooperative Threat Reduction programs with Russia, China, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He retired from DITRA in 2019, and as I indicated, is now a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. And Miles from the Middlebury Institute should be well known to this community, recognized author or co-author of many important reports and book chapters on arms control strategy, non-strategic nuclear weapons deterrence in Europe. And thanks to all of you for making the time to do this. Rose, let me turn it over to you for the next set of remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you all for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm very proud and glad to be joined by my colleagues, Miles Pomper, who's the principal investigator for this project, and William Moon, who has been working on a very important technical aspect of the project that he will speak to you about, which I think is a great innovation for all of us to consider as we look to the future of arms control and non-proliferation work. Actually, Brad, I'll pick up on the point you made that during the ratification process of New START, there was real pressure to ensure that we would take up non-strategic nuclear weapons in the Russian Federation and that we seek to get limits on them and reductions in them in the next strategic arms reduction negotiation. And this not only was a strong request and condition laid down, but is a legally binding requirement because it is inscribed in the resolution of ratification of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So it does have some legal heft associated with it as well. Knowing this, as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, I was working hard in 2011 and 12 to try to get the NATO allies in Europe interested in trying to tackle this problem. I have to admit that quite honestly, at the time, they were still very concerned about public outcry should the topic of nuclear weapons come more to the top of the agenda. And so I really got a lot of pushback during that time in talking at all about limits and constraints on non-strategic nuclear weapons, which would, of course, draw in the NATO nuclear mission. There are very few nuclear weapons, of course, associated with the NATO nuclear mission, but nevertheless, there are a number of weapons in Europe that are US weapons that are associated with the NATO nuclear mission. And of course, there are a number of basing countries. So it was a difficult moment. I realized at that time that we would have more work to do to convince the Allies that it was time to really tackle this problem. Let me also say at the outset that I give no truck whatsoever to the constant and long-standing Soviet and now Russian demand that until we are willing to rid ourselves of the NATO nuclear mission, return those weapons to CONUS, and take apart the infrastructure devoted to the NATO nuclear mission in Europe, that they will not be willing to speak to us about reductions in non-strategic nuclear warheads. I do not believe that we should at all contend with this particular proposition from the Russians. And in fact, it is a very firm red line as far as I am concerned. But I think that there are other ways to entice the Russians to the table here, particularly with regard to, as this administration has said, getting constraints on all nuclear warheads, strategic and non-strategic, deployed and non-deployed. That gets at, for the Russians, what is a great concern, and that is the US ability to upload. And so, again, we'll have perhaps some time to talk about this in the discussion period. Unfortunately, I am going to have to leave you because of some other requirements on my time at about 9:30 here on the Pacific Coast. But nevertheless, if there is some desire to talk about this further, Miles and my colleagues have heard me enough on it that I'm sure they'll be able to talk about it as well. But I do want to begin by stressing that point. So those are some basic introductory points. We need to treat the NATO nuclear mission as an aspect of a future strategic arms reduction negotiation, but we do not need to think about it according to the Russian demand that it be essentially done away with. So going forward from the undersecretary position, I was happy when I was NATO Deputy Secretary General to see that interest was beginning to increase in nuclear weapons again, and there were a number of reasons for that, but some very good work done by William Alberg, who was a member of this project team. He can't be with us today, but he at the time was responsible at NATO for working these issues. Since his departure, Wendon Smith, who many of you know, has taken up the agenda. Again, very good work on these issues. So by the time I was DSG, the level of interest was rising, and I thought we were in a better place to begin to tackle these issues with the NATO allies. And so when I departed and Miles came up with the idea of working to try to essentially help the NATO allies do some homework, they should get to a point of negotiations, United States and Russia being involved in a bilateral negotiation, but of course the allies standing behind the United States and providing support to the negotiations. So in the end of the day, the project has been widely supported by NATO allies, by Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and also by NATO partner Sweden, I hope soon to be a NATO member. Broad support and very good results in terms of talking to a broad audience in NATO, both government and non-government, about what the issues may be in an upcoming negotiation, and also making the allies aware of what the past has been, how we dealt with these issues during the time, for example, of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, and how we worked with the allies during that period. For some of them, especially those who are former members of the Warsaw Pact, this is a completely new territory. So they, I think, have really learned a lot in the course of this project, and it's been very, very interesting to hear their thoughts as well. I'm now going to pass the baton over to Miles to pick up where I left off, because he will be briefing you on a very interesting and broad-ranging series of interviews that we did around the NATO capitals, and the views that we heard from all the NATO allies, from one end of the alliance to the other. So without further ado, Miles, over to you.
Thanks, Rose, and thanks, Brad. Thanks to all of you for being here today. So let me just tell you, following up on Rose's background a little bit on the report itself. which is available online on the Center for Nonproliferation Studies website, nonproliferation.org. So, as Rose said, this was funded by 4 NATO allies and Sweden, and we had a terrific project team in addition to Rose and Marshall and William Alberk and Bill, and some people who worked with them. We also had Nikolai Sokov, who's a former Soviet and Russian arms control negotiator. So we had a very great, just terrific team on the project. And the research focused on the political, policy, legal, and technical issues that allies will likely have to address as the U.S. and, if the U.S. and Russia were to negotiate such an accord. We also carried out a series of interviews to understand the views in NATO states on the agreement and to gauge the constraints that allies in the United States could be expected to face in the process. And that was what Rose is referring to. I think it's important to note that the interviews and the primary drafting of the report occurred before the February 22 Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, this was drafted at a time when the strategic stability dialogue looked hopeful and was supposed to be kind of feeding into that process. Hopefully in the future, we will return to something where that will again be useful. But it's obviously not the moment for arms control negotiations right now. So in terms of the overview of the content, I gave you some of the elements. There's both a political section in terms of these allied interviews, but also some of the policy issues related to verification. There's legal issues, technical issues, and background on U.S. and Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons postures. Just to give you some sort of the executive summary, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the administration insisted that arms control talks with Russia cover all nuclear warheads, including non-strategic nuclear warheads. As all of you know, I'm sure, previous agreements with Russia had focused on delivery vehicles such as missiles, not the warheads themselves. In the wake of the Russian nuclear threats in the Ukraine conflict, such demands from the United States and the allies can only be expected to grow. And the U.S. side of such an agreement primarily affect an estimated 100 U.S. B-61 gravity bombs deployed at European bases in NATO countries. And it's important, a lot of the reason to do this report, as Rose was saying, is to help the allies do their homework. There's a need for NATO allies to be prepared to engage in substantive consultations with the U.S. during negotiation and implementation of such a treaty and ensure their interests are represented from the outset. Some of the conclusions and recommendations we came to. NATO allies want, this is, as I said, was before Ukraine. If you look at some of the recent polling, these numbers have even shifted much more dramatically, particularly in places like Germany. NATO allies want to keep existing non-strategic nuclear warheads, and they want an agreement limiting Russian non-strategic nuclear warheads, and they expect to be substantively consulted before each round of negotiations. Russia's behavior has helped reinforce allied views that maintaining NATO's current nuclear sharing arrangements is the right approach. However, the Ukraine invasion may reinforce some allies' doubts about the value of arms control agreements with Russia and its ability to keep its word in those agreements. Therefore, all allies need to be reassured that arms control and deterrence do not clash, but rather complement each other. Most of the Russian non-strategic nuclear warhead arsenal today supports the specific missions, such as a backup for its emerging long-range conventional capability, and therefore cannot be bargained away. However, there are some systems that are basically being phased out and may be able to be bargained away. Bill will talk more. Addressing non-strategic nuclear warheads will require overcoming operational and technical verification challenges that are made more difficult by issues of information security, definitions, and stockpile disparities. Bill will cover some of this in his talk. The experience in implementing, as Rose was saying, implementing the INF Treaty and other agreements and inspection regimes to which many NATO allies are party. Think of some of the CFE and Vienna document type agreements. provides a useful starting point for considering how the new treaty might be implemented and practical experience in preparing to host Russian inspectors, which is an important part of this. In advance of negotiations, allies should carry out a legal assessment to determine how domestic laws might need to be amended to carry out on-site inspections and other measures on their territory. They should also carry out a technical capability assessment to determine how they might need to improve their staffing of national verification entities to implement an agreement. Allies will also need to enhance the analytical and legal capabilities of their foreign and defense ministries when it comes to non-strategic nuclear weapons and arms control. Finally, sustained political engagement at the highest level will be essential to the success of any arms control initiative involving allies. So that's kind of the overview. I'd like to turn to Bill next to fill you in on the technical aspects. And we also have Marshall Brown, who's on this call, who can talk some on the legal aspects after Bill.
Before we pass over to Bill, I just wanted to underscore that point, which I should have made at the outset, and that is that this project, the work that went into this final report, Everything Counts, was completed well before the invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, we had hoped to get it out before the end of 2021. It got out right at the beginning of 2022. We finished the work. But then with the invasion looming, we had to pull it back and do some, of course, rewriting and caveating. But I just did want to underscore the point that Miles made, that nobody thinks we're going to go to the table anytime soon, but all of us still believe, and this view was really re-emphasized by our NATO colleagues during a conference when we rolled out the report a month ago in Copenhagen, that yes, we understand the situation is dire. It's a terrible, really an egregious situation with Russia at the moment, but we still need to be doing our homework and preparing for an eventual future, we hope, when we can get back to the negotiating table. But I did want to really re-emphasize that point, which I should have made at the outset. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Miles. Thank you to CGSR and Brad for inviting us today. I'm going to share some slides. One second. There we go. So first I want to say that we had a great technical team. You can see them listed here. Dan Zhukov is on the line, but we had some real experts from Stanford, Neil Perry, as well as DITRA experience on the U.S. nuclear security team for Warheads, Bill Delaney, as well as Marshall Brown and other technical experts, including Ferenc and George and Sammy. I want to say that my presentation here today, while we focused initially trying to get at the problem of non-strategic warheads, the technologies and the approach that we've developed here actually could be applied to any set of warheads that might be of interest in future discussions. Miles asked me to join the team early on based on the experience that we had in the Cooperative Threat Reduction program, working for many years with the 12th Main Directorate in Russia. 12th Main Directorate is responsible for nuclear security, safety, and custody of all the warheads in their inventory, both non-strategic and strategic warheads that are in storage, and they're responsible for all the logistics. So we used that experience, and the first thing our technical team did was, all right, if we wanted to do any kind of agreement or even a risk reduction type activity with the Russians addressing warheads as opposed to delivery systems, how would we go about that? So we started just looking at what are the challenges associated with trying to develop a regime and a methodology addressing warheads directly. Noting that one of the challenges has been is warheads are very small, they're mobile, they're difficult to detect and monitor. On-site inspections are very intrusive. Direct observation is nearly impossible. We would go to nuclear warhead storage sites, and you can't really see a warhead when you go to a storage site. And even if you had access to that warhead, it's often stored within a container within another container. And if you wanted to establish a regime just focused on serial numbers or markings, you really can't do that for warheads because they're moved around, they're moved in and out of containers. They're made up of various components. And in the Russian system, those components are changed out across their service life. So, all right, with those challenges, then we thought, how will we go about designing a data exchange methodology? How are we going to track warheads? You can't have verification if there isn't a way to tag or track the warheads throughout their service life. And the big challenges here is in tagging or tracking warheads, neither side is going to want to reveal sensitive information on the design, the composition, or the performance of warheads. There has been a lot of research done on trying to identify warheads by their individual emanations. It has a lot of sensitivity involved in it, and it has been difficult to implement and difficult to create any agreements for that. And in developing a way to tag and track warheads, we also don't want to create safety or security vulnerabilities that would identify where warheads are at specific times. And there, of course, especially on the Russian side, but on the US side as well, we don't want to disrupt warhead operations for either a risk reduction or an arms control agreement. So with those as our requirements, we then looked at, well, what was our previous experience working with the Russians on inventory management? And in fact, we had a long ongoing project, one of the central focuses of the CTR program that was probably not really well known, but was very important to nuclear security. And that is we worked together to develop the inventory management system in Russia that in many ways mirrors the current system called Diamonds that is managed out of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And in fact, the system in Russia called ACOMS for Automated Inventory Control and Management, and the Diamonds project management teams met several times over the course of the program, and they developed a good understanding of what is required to manage the inventory, the warhead inventory, to track where they are, where do they go. So we looked at that and said, well, current inventory management systems, they don't track warheads by their performance or by their physical appearance or composition. In fact, what they do is they track warheads by locations, movements, other transactions such as security checks, audits, inventories conducted, and so forth. And during the course of our exchanges and some mill-to-mill exchanges, we actually shared a lot of this kind of data with each other during our cooperative times. We shared data on warhead storage, how are things stored and secured. We shared information about warhead transport, what sort of vehicles and escorts are done for warheads. In fact, one of the interesting projects we had was we helped to ship non-strategic and strategic warheads from storage sites to dismantlement locations. It was very interesting how we did that because, how would you go about verifying and validating that such a shipment actually occurred? Well, came up with a creative way to do that. The Russians actually would give us 30 days after a shipment occurred, they would give us precise number of kilometers of their shipment that they conducted. Based on that information, we were able to use NTM to verify and validate for ourselves that that shipment actually did occur as they said, and we made payments for it. So you can see during our cooperation, a lot of these elements that are included in inventory management and the data involved in that, including component shipments that the Russians conducted, um, were shared with each other. So we thought about that problem and said, well, if such information might be able to be shared, um, that historical logistics data is not as sensitive as design, composition, or performance. Perhaps it or some of it could be exchanged. And if that could be exchanged, then couldn't we use that data to create a unique identifier or a warhead passport to track individual warheads? We use the word passport because that's actually the term the Russians used when we started the inventory management program. associated with each warhead, when it traveled or when it was transported or any transaction, there was a physical paper passport that the Russians kept very close guard on and used to record every transaction associated with that passport. So we're thinking, well, that's a good terminology. It's a good concept. And it could be used then if you take all that data in that passport, it's like a fingerprint. And perhaps it's a virtual tool you could use to identify and track warhead transactions over their service life. Now, looking at all of that data, some of it can be exchanged, and in fact, a good amount of it could be exchanged. But when you look at it, you say, well, you would never want to exchange a complete history of a warhead life cycle. That would be too sensitive. It would give you information about the lifetime of a warhead, how often it had to be maintained, and that sort of thing. So is there a way that we can use some of the data, create a unique identifier to track individual warheads without sharing all of it up at once? And so that's when we met with some of the renowned worldwide experts on cryptography who suggested using hash codes, cryptographic hash codes, to represent that warhead data might be a way where we could use that as sort of as a label for each warhead that doesn't contain all of the data, but represents individual warheads. And so a hash code, this is not encryption of data. Rather, the data that we would select and agree between the parties to be part of a warhead passport can be used to create a hash code or string of letters and digits that represents individual warheads and is unique for each of that warheads. The hash function is a one-way function. It can't be reversed. And no two data sets would yield the same code when run through the same hash function. So this technology then we think could be a very useful way to develop a data exchange methodology to track individual warheads. Each warhead and every transaction conducted by the warhead could be represented by an individual hash code. And that could be used to create a unique identifier to track individual warheads in order to support any sort of risk reduction or arms control agreement that we might be able to develop once the political situation evolves in a way that we could have such discussions. So to give you sort of a vision of what this looks like, this is a representation of what might be a warhead passport. You can see it has date, time, location, status, components. Any one of these blocks is very similar to some of the data that we have exchanged with the Russians in the past. They've been to our sites. We've been to their sites. They've been to, we brought a Russian delegation, F.E. Warren, into Kings Bay, Georgia. And of course, every one of their warhead storage sites where the non-strategic and strategic warheads are stored, we went to 3 times during the course of improving and enhancing the nuclear security at those sites. So you can see that's what a passport might look like, the kinds of data that would be included in it. And each subsequent transaction then could be added to that passport, represented by a new hash in a way that you can track the history of a warhead without revealing all of the data that would be much too sensitive. So when you look at this methodology, then we use the terminology step by step to describe it because a baseline under this approach is different than a baseline that we have had for previous arms control agreements. Under previous agreements, a baseline would involve going out and verifying all of the data that is exchanged up front. To give you a full and complete baseline. A baseline under this exchange, however, would only involve the exchange of a ledger of hash codes, essentially that represent the inventory such that you know you have a total number, but you don't have much information about that inventory up front. And you have cryptographic technologies that are protecting that data in a way that is not exchanged up front. That data instead would be exchanged over time in a step-by-step manner. And that's where we came up with the notion of a data challenge. data challenges, which is different than an on-site inspection challenge. A data challenge would be that an observing party would request the host to decommit some of the data from a warhead passport, such as an individual transaction, and they would confirm that that particular data that was revealed through the hash function matches what was used to create the hash code in the first place, such that you, in a step-by-step fashion, you gain confidence in what's behind all of the data and in the identification of all of the hash codes over time. The data is revealed step by step. Each challenge then reveals more data. Confidence builds over time. One caution here is that for security reasons, you would not want to exchange current information on where warheads are located. Much like we did when we paid for warhead shipments 30 days after a shipment occurred, it's not as sensitive to say where a warhead has been. It is very sensitive, however, to say where it is today or where it will be. And we can use all of that data and use data challenges then to reveal the pieces of each of the passport over time and increase the validity of the overall ledger. Here's a visualization of the challenge process. So you can sort of get a mind's eye view of how it would work. A host party derives the hash code from passport information, from the life cycle information of individual warheads. They provide the hash and commit it to the other party, red to blue, for example. The party issues a data challenge then for that commitment. Was part of it's revealed. You run it through the hash code to make sure that it is in fact the same data that was used to create the hash code in the first place. And that way, the observing party can validate that that data, as it's been revealed through a mathematical proof, comparing it to the original commitment, matches the particular warhead that you are tracking. Okay, if there's any change in the original data between those steps, the hash code would be different and you would know that it was manipulated. And so the interesting thing about data challenges is that you could then use your NTM or any other intelligence or known data points to further increase the confidence in that data. For example, as I talked about earlier, we knowingly shared information about NTM that could track warhead shipments in Russia with the Russians. So through NTM, for example, you may have information on a particular rail transfer that occurred at a rail transfer point in Russia on a certain date and time. And the advantage of this approach too is that date and time could be in past history. It could have been 3 or 5 years ago that you've gathered that data. But then you use that information to issue your challenge and get the other side to reveal data associated with that particular shipment that you know occurred and can then validate the data. So you have other methodologies then to increase your confidence over time. So sort of to sum this up a little bit, this concept is not intended as a comprehensive verification solution. Rather, it's a foundation from which we believe verification R&D can be used to develop a more comprehensive approach to a future risk reduction or treaty involving all warheads, be that non-strategic and strategic. We have briefed this around the community a fair amount, and in fact, the State Department has awarded us a contract or a grant to develop a tabletop demonstration of the concept. And we are in the process. We've actually built notional passports for both red and blue. We have created hash codes and written a hash code program to validate the data within the passports. We're in the process right now of writing some examples of data challenges that could be used to use this, to further prove this concept out. And we plan to do a demonstration of the concept later this year or early next year to a large audience. And we'll be videotaping it and providing it to the State Department so that they might use it for any future type agreement. And I also want to emphasize that this methodology, it can be applied to the entire inventory if we were able to have such discussions, or even agreed subset of data. And this is where we started the project, thinking about non-deployed, non-strategic warheads in the European region. And you can even think about it about the warheads that are within the region close to Ukraine. I visited a couple of the sites where warheads are stored that are not far from the Ukraine border. So if you wanted to use this methodology to address a small subset of data exchange for transparency or safety and security reasons, this methodology could be tailored and applied to that sort of approach. Perhaps it could enable the sites to build confidence in a data exchange over time and create a foundation for future verification. And I think I will get off the stage there. And if Katie can help me stop sharing, we can go on to discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, well, Bill. Thank you, Miles. And I think Rose has gone off to her other obligation.